I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
I appreciate this so much, Marat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, so welcome back to Just Nowhere in my program. And yeah, I've really been excited, looking forward to this, to hear about, well, your relatively recent book. I guess it's your latest book, is that right? This is Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, and that's Brandeis University last year?
It came out, actually, no, 2023 is the publication date. It came out a little earlier, but it's considered 2023. So
yeah, excellent. Well, I wanted to start things off, and you can go anywhere you want to, whenever you want to. Just let me know. But I thought it would be a good way, a good strategy to start with talking about Leo Strauss. Right? I think that's really one of the key ways to understand your entire approach of this book. So can you fill us in, first of all, like, who was Leo Strauss, right? And why is he relevant to the topic of your last book?
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
I enjoyed our
my pleasure.
Last conversation about sci-fi and the Strugatsky's very much, and so it's great to talk about my this latest book and
wonderful
and latest project. So yeah, I think you're right that Strauss, Leo Strauss, and his idea in particular about writing between the lines is crucial to sort of how I think about Soviet Jewish culture and what I call the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. But just a little kind of preface on Strauss. He was a political science thinker, a philosopher, a classicist, right? Kind of really spent most of his life writing commentary on the classical Greek texts, Plato and kind of the although also kind of medieval Arabic philosophy, medieval Jewish philosophy,
and up to Nietzsche.
Right?
Yeah.
So kind of a idiosyncratic thinker in many respects, a German Jew, right? And he comes up. That comes out of that German Jewish intellectual milieu, and was Jewish, leaves Germany because of Nazism, ends up in the United States and teaches at the University of Chicago for the rest of his life, where there is a circle of kind of disciples that forms around him. And I think, I'm not sure to what extent that played out in Europe, kind of the European reception of Strauss, but in the United States, unfortunately, there has been sort of somewhat of a very simplistic, although I think that went away to some extent, but
yeah, neocon appropriation,
right? So around the second Bush administration, the W administration and the war in Iraq. A number of kind of books came out and pieces that really saw Strauss as the godfather of the kind of neocon politics, and
this is really bizarre to me, but that's what happened.
Right. I mean, there's some sort of biographical truth to that. Again, some of the people who were around him, but he certainly was, as I said, a political. He was interested in politics, not politics of the day, not the kind of the immediate politics, but politics in a much grander way. So I think it is a simplistic way of looking at Strauss. And since then, there have been some, a number of serious studies of Strauss that came out. There is a whole series on Strauss at I think at CUNY, City University of New York.
That's right.
Or SUNY, I think SUNY.
SUNY. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, and I'm not a Strauss scholar. I should just preface. I'm interested in certain in certain aspects of his of his philosophy, particularly this idea of of writing between the lines, and also interested in Strauss as a Jewish thinker, right? And how he thought about heritage and identity, and what he made of that. Interestingly, in his early days, he was associated with the revisionist wing of the Zionist movement.
That's right.
Headed by Vladimir Zeev Jabotinsky, a fascinating figure, a writer, really major. Now we really appreciate him as a major Russian writer.
Yes.
In his own right, but as I said, kind of a multifaceted, fascinating figure, writer, poet, who becomes head of the revisionist movement within Zionism, and so Strauss was part of that was part of that milieu, and I think they even met with Jabotinsky at some point, and. So yes, so the piece of Strauss's the Strauss piece that I'm interested in is this essay where he talks about how writers who live in a totalitarian environment, right, authoritarian environment, and again he's thinking back to kind of the classical age, the classical period, although really thinking about the situation in Nazi Germany, right? What writers do in order to protect themselves, right? In order essentially to save their lives, right? And he talks about that they come up with this method of writing their texts in a two-tiered way, right? So on the top, the first layer is what he calls an exoteric layer that is accessible to everybody, right? To the general public, and they do with it whatever they do, right? But then there is another layer, the esoteric layer, that is accessible only to those readers who are able to unlock it, appreciate it, right? And then this community is formed between the author and again those readers who are able to access this second layer, right? And so this idea of writing between the lines and then reading between the lines, and so I use that again very much to illustrate how Jewishness functioned in the Soviet context, although that's applicable to a more general Soviet context, but it works particularly well if we're trying to understand again how Jewish knowledge was circulated in the Soviet Union, and this kind of special relationship that was formed between Jewish readers and the authors.
I came to know Strauss actually in some readings in Jewish biblical studies, right? Because is very relevant to understand a text like the Book of Daniel, right, in the Tanakh, because there you have a document that is written during the Maccabean revolt, and in order to tell this story, right, in order to criticize the Seleucid Empire, right, the author has to do all of the criticizing and denunciation in an animal allegory, right? So right, the evil empires are represented by different animals, right? And so that this is a very good example, right, from pre-modern times of Strauss's model of this esoteric writing, right? And so it gives I think a whole new level of complexity and complexion, right, to the Jewishness of this concept, right? That it goes back, right, as I think as far back, really. I mean, I think we can see it even in like Bereshit in the book of Genesis, right? There's these dialogues. There is on the esoteric level, maybe there's difference of opinion among biblical scholars, but maybe the ejection, right, from the Garden of Eden is sort of like a cipher for the exile, right, from Judea to Babylon. And so again, you have this esoteric level, but then the exoteric. And a final point before turning it back over to you is to see how Jewish that is. All you have to do is think of, right, the first and fourth levels of the traditional pardes, right? The four levels of interpretation of scripture. The first one is the peshet, the exoteric. The last one is the sod, the esoteric. So, it sort of streamlines it.
Yeah.
And takes out the middle two and just has the exoteric and esoteric, which really agrees with the simple model of Philo of Alexandria, where he just has, you have the plain level and then you have the allegorical, he calls it.
Right.
So very Jewish, very ancient.
Right, absolutely. Or what you call kind of in rabbinic exegesis, the pshat level, right? The sort of the what's on the surface,
the simple level.
The simple level, although that's not a kind of derogatory term, right? I mean, it's
not at all,
not in the sense that it's simplistic, right? But that's sort of what's on the top, right? The fact, the data, right? And then the drush, right? The what requires kind of getting underneath it. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Kind of these two for Strauss, these two universes. The Judaic universe, right? It's Jewish scripture on the one hand, and then the Greek texts on the other hand, right? And this kind of the dialogue, kind of the Athens and Jerusalem, as Lev Shestov, the Russian Jewish philosopher, put it, the dialogue between them, the competition between them, kind of who has the primacy,
right? Which Strauss, did he? I think it was an essay, right? He also has this where he addresses Athens and Jerusalem.
Yes,
right?
yes,
right. So it's probably based on that. But by the way, since you're interested in his Jewishness, and I'm sure you're aware of his post-war, post-Holocaust presentation that he gave, followed by a question and answer, which has been transcribed and published. And I can't recall the publisher. I don't believe it's SUNY, but it's a different university publisher. But why remain Jewish?
Yeah. Can that yellow?
Yeah, very powerful.
Yes.
In many ways, but also is very powerful for understanding Strauss himself.
Right. And yeah, because for him, as I say, right, that's sort of the competition between revelation on the one hand, right, and the Jewish model, and then the Greek model, the philosopher model. I think for him, ultimately, kind of the philosopher, is on top. And so, why remain Jewish? Not because he's an observant Jew, right? Not because he believes in revelation, but because of just the value of identity and tradition, right? And also, Strauss is a conservative thinker. I mean, conservative with sort of the capital C, not in a kind of simplistic political.
Yeah, maybe with qualifying marks, since the words are polysemous these days.
right. And so yeah. So why I think again, applying kind of his idea of esoteric layers within text to the Soviet Jewish situation, right? Again, we need to do it cautiously. Yeah, because I'm certainly not arguing in this book that the Soviet Jews were these were these scholars who were able to access these deep layers. Some,
Understood.
Some could, and it also doesn't apply to all the texts that I'm talking about. Often, kind of this ability to sort of get at what the author is trying to convey was more intuitive, right? Was more in a sense of, again, they felt that they share this this language. But why I think it really works, Strauss's model really works in the Soviet Jewish case, more so than, of course, the idea that there are what's called Aesopian language, right? Kind of this double speak in Soviet literature is a well-known fact, right?
Yes.
And there have been studies of that. But why I think Strauss's model is more accurate in some respects is because Strauss, and I quoted in the book, he says that before you get to that esoteric layer, right, you should not at all bypass the exoteric.
Very Jewish.
Right. In other words, they really do coexist, these two layers. Yeah.
Yes.
And in the text that I'm discussing here, particularly, for instance, the texts that were written about Judaism in the Soviet Union, right, from the position of what was called the school of scientific atheism. Yeah,
yes.
which essentially said, all religions are horrible, opium for the masses, etc., etc., including Judaism, but we have to study them to understand them, right? And so I'm using those books, which are just filled with this propagandist material, and are filled with what some would interpret as pretty vile language about Judaism. But I'm very much reading at least some of those books as an example of this, writing between the lines, right? And where again, this ideological language can't be just thrown away, can't be bypassed, right? But we really understand how that esoteric pops in various places, and it could be just a word, it could just be a hint, it could be a piece of information, right? And I have to say, I mean, that part of my book and various presentations that I did about it, and I got some slack for it, right? And people who do know kind of the Soviet context well and came out of it, particularly those who were kind of in the dissident camp in the Jewish underground, sort of said, no, not at all. I mean, those books were just all horrible, and it's pure propaganda. Or some scholars, who disagree with me made that point that, but I disagree. I really think that at least in some of them, you can really see the Straussian model, and particularly this one scholar that I'm thinking about, Mikhail Shakhnovich, who was a professor at the Leningrad State University, a very educated Jew, in a sense that, I mean, he was definitely what we call an apikoirist, right? Somebody who disdained tradition.
Right.
Early on, kind of wanted to leave all of that behind, but was fascinated in it, right? And his first book about the Talmud, again, very much from this sort of, antagonistic viewpoint, comes out when he was 19, right? And later he writes these books like The Dusk of Judaic Religion and about the Judaism as a reactionary religion. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, you look on the surface, it is kind of this very typical, very negative presentation of Judaism. But here and there, you can really piece a picture. Just basic information about Judaism that was not accessible at all, but also something deeper. And very interestingly, later in his life, during the Perestroika years, he gave an interview where he essentially said, without invoking Strauss, but he said, that's what I did, right? I was writing between the lines. I had kind of these different layers in mind. And that's what we did. It doesn't turn him into a dissident hero, not at all. Right. The system and function within the system, but to sort of appreciate again how Jewish knowledge, as I said, circulated in an environment where there was no public space, for Jewishness, and of course Judaism as a religion being completely denigrated as any other religion in the Soviet Union. So I guess what I'm saying is that Strauss's model is kind of cautiously useful, right?
Right. Well, I would interject here and say, because I myself have also studied a lot of authors from the Soviet period in depth, right? Many of them, right, ended up with a bullet in their head during the Stalinist purges, or ended up at the Gulag in Kazakhstan or something like this. It seems to me that on a human level, right, if one feels that their destiny or their personality or their life finds meaning only if they can write, they feel that they are an author or that there's some intellectual figure, by default, they have to write. They have to be engaged intellectually, but an authoritarian system is going to impose all kinds of limits on what they can say, right? And so I actually think also, yes, we have to apply the Strauss model cautiously, but not over cautiously.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think it is very useful, and it really works and speaks to that Soviet condition, in a sense, beginning to speak to, again, what is happening in Russia today with the much more, there's no return kind of to the Soviet censorship, at least not yet, not at all.
Not yet.
But it has become much more difficult to say what you want to say, especially about the ongoing war, and so people again are sort of invoking kind of the Soviet times and thinking about how what it took to survive in that environment intellectually. And it's interestingly, some of the books that I'm discussing, which were sort of so important for Soviet Jews and stood on their bookshelves, are coming back, right? And again, the Strugatsky brothers that we've talked about,
right?
Or Leon Feuchtwanger, for instance, or
let's do a segue here and get to, I think, another one of the main bedrocks, right, of your model, right, where you found a very important, your central metaphor, right, and this is Osip Mandelstam, right, and what he has to do. But before we get to the metaphor you use, let's talk about Osip Mandelstam, the man, right? So the audience gets a feel for where he was from, what he did, and the tragic ending, right, of his life.
Yeah, great.
And also his heritage today, right, throughout the world. Actually, he's very respected and loved.
Right. Mandelstam, right? Osip Mandelstam is certainly one of the kind of major Russian poets of the 20th century. He is, part of what we call now the Silver Age of Russian literature, particularly Russian poetry. And modern Russian literary history is a little bit bizarre in the sense that it begins, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, with Pushkin. Yeah.
That's right, yes.
Alexander Pushkin, right? And Pushkin did everything, poetry and prose, history writing. But of course, poetry was front and center, right? And Pushkin's age is what the scholars have called the golden age of Russian literature, where poetry is front and center. And then, with the exception of a number of important poets like Nekrasov, for instance, who work in the 19th century, but it's really the novels, the Tolstoy, Turgenev, that become really important in Russian literature. And then when we get into the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when we get to and called the Silver Age, poetry again, poetry is again front and center, although of course there are a number of very important prose writers as well.
Sure.
And so Mandelstam is one of the key figures within this Silver Age that has a number of important poetic, artistic movements. He is part of the movement that's called Acmeism, which is very much in reaction to the symbolist movement. And what the Acmeists were arguing is that we need to kind of get down to earth, right? We need to stop thinking about the heavens and the stars. I'm simplifying, right? And
of course,
and kind of these lofty matters. We need to come back down to earth and look at the language as an instrument, right? To look at the language as a matter, right? And so that's actually Mandelstam's kind of the image that he uses, sort of the poet as a stonemason, right? Who takes the board and starts chiseling. The tragedy is that, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution happens, and Mandelstam stays in Russia, stays in the Soviet Union, and he really feels that, and that's the image that he uses in his poems, that sort of the century that he is a part of has been broken in half. The vertebrae of the century has been broken in half, and he, a man of that pre-Bolshevik world, is in this new world and doesn't quite know how to behave in it, right? As an older, to finish with sort of the biography, he writes an epigram about Stalin, pretty fierce epigram where he talks about Stalin's cockroach mustache and this fear that envelops everything because of Stalin. This epigram reaches Stalin, who sends Mandelstam into exile, and ultimately he sent to the camps where he dies at the end of the 1930s.
1937.
Yes, probably around that time. We don't have the exact sort of, and or the exact burial place, but dies in the camp, and there are all these stories about sort of Mandelstam, sitting in the camp and in a delirious state reciting his poetry. And although these are more from the kind of the legend.
Sure. Born in 1891, incidentally.
Born in 1891, right, in a Jewish family, raised in St. Petersburg, and Petersburg is incredibly important.
Yes.
For culture, incredibly important. For Mandelstam, I should say that there are two. If you look at the kind of the earlier scholarship on Mandelstam, particularly in the West, and a lot of why we have Mandelstam's poetry, the later poetry, is really thanks to his widow Nadezhda Mandelstam.
Mm-hmm.
Who memorized a lot of them, right? Because they could actually written on paper, and worked very hard on returning, his legacy to the reader as much as it was possible, in the Soviet Union. And Nadezhda Mandelstam wrote a very important set of memoirs, in English translated as "Hope Against Hope," her first.
Hope Against Hope.
Right, which in sort of in the Western scholars during the Cold War very much looked at Mandelstam really as an example of somebody who was just absolutely, opposed to the Soviet system, not able to communicate with it at all, and being a victim of it. The younger generation of scholars also in Russia, in the Soviet Union and Russia, and I probably would include myself in that category, see Mandelstam's life and biography and his engagement with the Soviet authorities is much more complex.
Sure.
Both in terms of his sympathy, both in terms of really him trying to fit in, right, and become part of that universe. He writes another poem about Stalin that glorifies Stalin, and which can be seen as just again an attempt to survive. But it is also an example of that kind of Straussian writing between the lines. But it's also some having, for instance, Joseph Brodsky really saw it as perhaps Mandelstam's greatest poem, which doesn't make Mandelstam a Stalinist, but shows that again sort of his engagement with the Soviet project was much more complex than previously thought. Another big element of Mandelstam's oeuvre and kind of just his artistic philosophy is his Jewishness, and that also has gone through a number of kind of revisionist readings. And again, I myself in that kind of more revisionist camp. Mandelstam converted to Christianity, and which some have interpreted as just an attempt he needed to get into university, and right,
so like Mahler in Austria.
It was a very sort of practical, pragmatic step. But at the same time, if you look especially at his earlier period, he really was fascinated in the link between Christianity and art. And the idea of art and poetry is imitating Christ. So there's a significant. It's also hard to be a major Russian poet without taking Christianity seriously. I mean, it's just the fact of kind of.
It's the surrounding culture and the air one breathes in Russia.
Right. And so again, some, and Nadezhda Mandelstam played a role here, and his widow who was a real convert to Christianity. I mean, she was a believing Christian, and who very much sort of tried to basically essentially say, yes, he was Jewish, but that's where it ended, right? I mean, but if we look closely, and scholars have done it, and including myself, there's a very significant Jewish layer in Mandelstam's poetry, but also especially in Mandelstam's prose. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Mandelstam was a Jewish poet, Jewish writer, and it all depends on how we define it.
Sure.
But it's absolutely clear that Jewish layer was kind of very thick of his artistic thinking, of his poetry, and as I said, of his prose. And so the image that I take the image of the bookshelf
Mhm.
that I use in my book comes from Mandelstam's autobiography called The Noise of Time,
Mhm.
Шум времени in Russian, which he writes in the
Right,
19th, where he talks about a bookcase in his parents' household, right? And he
right.
sees that bookcase as what he calls a geological bed, right? And which has all of these different layers, different tiers, and on the very bottom he sees what he calls a Judaic chaos, all these Jewish books, scripture kind of thrown around, dusty, never touched. And as you go up, you have the classics of kind of in the very center. You have the classics of German literature, you have the classics of Russian literature, right? Somewhere below you have Russian Jewish literature, right? And anyway, so all of these layers, and Mandelstam says that's essentially what makes me who I am, and that's what makes an intelligent, right? A member of intelligentsia, right? He uses the term raznachinец, right? This is who you are. That's what defines who you are. That's kind of the layers within the parents' bookcase. And so I take that idea and apply it to the bookshelves, bookcases that were in Soviet Jewish household, including my own,
yours, yes,
my own parents' bookcase, and sort of looking at all these different tiers. What was in the center? What was hidden somewhere, deep? What was on the sides, etc., right? And very much seeing it as the sort of this geological bed, which I, as a scholar, as a person, right, as an individual, sort of starting to excavate, digging out all these different layers with the hope that it will give an understanding of a larger culture.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's a very good overview of Mandelstam. I can't help but say this, right? It's a very, for me, as for a lot of people, right? Mandelstam is almost a sacred figure. The person he was, but his the poetry, right, is like all poetry, right? It really can't be adequately appreciated in translation. Unfortunately, that's just the facts. But for the sake of the audience, right, I fear that many of them will hear us talk about Osip Mandelstam, and that'll be it. So let me read one stanza, right, from one of his last poems. It's one of my favorite, from 1937. Right, so it's mountains of skulls vanish on the horizon. Right, I must decrease and be seen no more. Yet in the embrace of books and in children's games, I will rise from death and sing, behold the sun. For me, that's quintessential Mandelstam. Right, and of course, it also has the image of books in there. Right.
Yeah. No, absolutely right, and you can see the complexity and the incredible kind of philosophical and artistic universe that's at the heart of his poetry, right? Which goes through different stages, but at the same time. But at the same time, it is very much a kind of this unified philosophy. Yeah, as is true of kind of the poets of his of his rank, of his level. But this idea of a book, and as he says in another poem, that he imagines himself as a book, and becoming a book is very much is very central to him. And Mandelstam becomes very, very important to the generation of the thaw period, and which is really the period with which I'm starting my book. So after Stalin's death, right, the number of reforms that initiated by Khrushchev, very cautious reforms, right, that say, yeah, Stalin made some mistakes, and we need to do to do some things differently, but those very cautious reforms, short lasting really, but they really do lead to a wide cultural renaissance in literature, in visual arts and cinema. And what happens during that period is the return of the writers who were either, killed by Stalin, who were either banned or forgotten. Yeah. And Mandelstam is part of that, right? He is not at all acknowledged as really part of the canon, during part of the official canon during the Soviet period. But there are some publications, there are collections of his poetry that come out, and those were absolutely treasured by the Soviet intelligentsia in general, but also by the Soviet Jewish reader.
Right. Well, for the sake of time, before we revisit the Strugatsky brothers, which I want to do because of your comments on them in regard to the Holocaust and Kafka, I did want you to briefly or at length mention this one example that you give. Of course, a long discussion, right? But this was a way for Soviet Jews, right, through reading sort of like historical novels with commentaries on actual Jewish history to become aware of Jewish history in sort of a safe way.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And I think you're talking about Leon Feuchtwanger.
That's right.
Yeah. I should say, just to preface this, and so that the listeners can appreciate again some of that Soviet Jewish situation. There was, of course, anti-Semitism. I mean, not right. I mean that was a huge,
of course,
huge part, right? It kind of permeated everywhere. Yeah, it meant that you couldn't advance in your job. You couldn't be admitted into certain universities. You had trials, financial crime trials where Jews were specifically targeted, right?
Scapegoated. So.
Right, scapegoated. So that was part of daily life. Yeah.
Right.
At the same time, Jews were the educated class by and large, right? They were your teachers and your engineers and your professors and your filmmakers. Were heavily involved in what we can call kind of commerce in the Soviet Union. So all of that was there. But the bigger problem was that, as I said earlier, there was no public space for expressing Jewishness, right? And again, we need to separate here between Judaism as a religion. So that's much clearer, right? So Soviet Union was an atheist state, right? Where all religions, there was, according to the Soviet constitution, there was freedom of religion, right? You could, if you choose to, but of course in reality it was very, very different. And Judaism as a religion, right? It was disdained. It was essentially destroyed. And so we can, that picture is much clearer. And a great majority of Soviet Jews of that post-World War II period were not religious. They were secular. Yeah.
Right.
But the murkier picture, more interesting picture is again that there was no public space for any expression of Jewishness. Again, I'm not talking about religion, but any expression. Yeah.
Right.
Again, I should correct myself because there was sort of that one corner, the Yiddish corner. Yeah, which were the remaining speakers of Yiddish, where the state allowed the publication of the Yiddish magazine and said we can get into that. So the picture is complex. Yeah. But generally speaking, there was no public space for expressing Jewishness, right? Just the word Jew carried with itself either kind of derogatory, sort of sentiments or laughter or things like that, right?
Right. Some of the literature from the golden era in Russia was very a lot of hatred of Jews.
Right.
It's part of the culture.
Yeah, and so on paper, officially, Soviet Jews were acknowledged as an ethnicity. Yeah, but in reality, it was something that was completely, there was just a complete silence about it. Plus, if there was anything, again, it was negative. Yeah, directed toward religion or Israel, etc. But at the same time, there was Soviet Jewish identity. Soviet Jews knew that they were different. Yeah. And what I'm arguing is in my book is that it was not just an intuitive understanding of difference, or difference provoked only by the fact that, you know, those who are around you hate you, or the state hates. But what I'm arguing is that it was deeper, it was more complex, and it did have a component, a cultural component, right? And if we're talking about a cultural component, we need to talk about knowledge, right?
Yes.
And so the only really meaningful way that space, public space, existed for expressing Jewishness came from books. Yeah.
Yes.
Came from books, and you know, books were treasured in the Soviet Union because just like everything else, you couldn't just go out and get it, right? You needed to have connections, you needed to stand in lines, you needed all sorts of things, right, to get the books that you wanted.
Right.
And these bookcases in the Soviet apartments were front and center. And very often those bookcases were the only visible and public expressions of Jewishness, right? Because if you came into an apartment where a Jewish family, Soviet Jewish family lived, right, you clearly would not find a mezuzah on the door,
right?
Or you would not find, you know, a menorah standing,
right?
You know, or something like that. But if you looked at the bookcase, and that's the first thing that sort of, at least within kind of the intelligentsia circles, you walk into an apartment, the first thing that you look at the books in the bookcase, and there were certain signals. If you saw the 6 volumes of Sholem Aleichem, or if you saw the 12 volumes of Leon Feuchtwanger, or if you saw something else, that was a signal that it's a Jewish home. And very interestingly, again, and that shows sort of how this totalitarian system thinks or doesn't think, right? That
doesn't.
While again this anti-Semitism permeated everything, on the other hand, the Soviet Union allowed for these Jewish books to be published in these massive, enormous quantities, right? So the return to the one writer that you had in mind is Leon Feuchtwanger, who's a major German Jewish novelist in his time, you know, from the 1920s and on, best-selling author, writing about, he's a historical novelist, writing about ancient history, medieval history, very much sort of immediate, what was happening in front of his eyes when Hitler comes to power. He was a very educated Jew, came from a kind of Orthodox family, and a lot of his books are Jewish books. That is, they're purely kind of Jewish subject matter, be it, you know, about Yud Zeus, or his trilogy about Josephus, you know, the ancient Jewish historian who witnesses the destruction of the Second Temple and of Judea, or his book about medieval Jewish history. He leaves Germany, obviously, you know, when Hitler comes to power. He is very much a man of the left, who affiliated with the Soviet Union, ends up in the United States through France, and, you know, lives for the rest of his life, dies in 1950s, lives in LA in the Pacific Palisades, right next to Thomas Mann and, you know, Werfel, and that community was the kind of the heart of this emigre German, not just German Jewish community, but German community in general. So Feuchtwanger's novels are published in these massive quantities in the Soviet Union. He's seen as a major writer, and so for Soviet Jews, it really it becomes what I call their scripture. Why? Not just because the subject matter of his novels was so explicitly Jewish, and the content was complex but also positive, right? His presentation of was very much a positive presentation, but also, as you mentioned, right, at the back of those volumes, you had a thorough appendices, commentary, that would, in a pretty just kind of information sort of way, tell you about everything that the novel contained. If it was about Josephus, which would have a plethora of information about, you know, Jewish scripture and ancient Jewish history, so you would have commentary on that. If it was medieval, you know, a novel like the Spanish Ballad about medieval Jewish history, Toledo, so you would have information about that, etc., right? So this was this was, at least for those readers who would look in the back, and a lot of them would look in the back, yeah, it was a way to learn a lot
Right.
of Jewish history. Why, again, why that was so important? Because you would go through the entire 10 years of secondary school.
Right.
History would be, I still did that, in my Ukrainian Soviet school, right? So one year was completely devoted to ancient history. Another year was devoted to medieval history, much more thorough than American high school.
Yes.
School education. But not once would there be any mention of Jews. Not once, right? So not in a negative sense or derogatory sense. No, there is just a gap.
It's complete silence.
Complete silence, as if they never existed, That would be true also of the university education, unless, again, you were high up, writing a dissertation on a certain topic and you had access to certain books. I mean, right. But overall, just complete silence. But then you had your Feuchtwanger, beautifully published, right? These were kind of these, and with that commentary. And it's interesting, in writing the book, I looked at some of the earlier histories of Soviet Jews, written by Israeli scholars, written by American scholars during the Cold War, even later, where they say there's nothing, right? I mean, of course they didn't know anything. How could they? But what those scholars completely overlook is, again, somebody like Feuchtwanger and that layer. And it's really interesting, right? I mean, Feuchtwanger, there is a sort of a revival of interest in Feuchtwanger among, those studying German literature.
Sure.
Feuchtwanger Society. His archive, where I worked, is at USC in LA, but ultimately he's a forgotten writer.
Yes, that's right.
His novels are pretty much all out of print. In English. He was a big deal in the German Democratic Republic. But as far as I understand, again, by and large, he's not well known in contemporary Germany, unless those who sort of really professionally studied. And that was my impetus for writing the book. When I was a student at Columbia University as an undergraduate, having just lived a couple of years in the United States, and I came to talk to my German professor, taking a course in German literature, and I mentioned something about, and I think I said, instead of saying Feuchtwanger, I said it the way that it is said in Russian, Feuchtwanger. And when he finally realized what I was saying, he said, "Why?"
Right.
It was astonishing. And I said, "What do you mean, why?" I mean, he's just like greatest writer and who was, our everything. And he said, first of all, it was clear that he never read him, and second, it was clear that there was not much interest.
Right, considered a minor author. Let's put it that way.
Very, very minor. I'm not gonna. I mean, the professor was wonderful. He's actually sort of a major scholar who played a large role in life, and I think he actually later wrote about Feuchtwanger. But overall, that was sort of the impetus, and really showed that these intellectual universes, Soviet Jewish intellectual universe, was really inaccessible to the American audience, to everybody else, unless they knew somebody like Feuchtwanger, right? Because if you read, let's say you read Elie Wiesel, and the book that he writes in the early 1960s, The Jews of Silence, right, where he goes to the Soviet Union and writes this very poignant book where he essentially says that Soviet Jews are Jews of silence because they're not allowed to practice their religion. And then he says American Jews are also Jews of silence because you're not doing anything to help the Soviet Jews get out of the Soviet Union. But what Wiesel completely misses is that, great majority of Soviet Jews were not yearning to be, religious and suffering because, of the lack of piety, although there were certainly some,
sure.
I'm not, but the great majority, right, what made them in their eyes, what made them Jewish, again, came from these very secular books, right? And without uncovering that layer, it's very hard to appreciate what made this, the third largest Jewish community in the 20th century after the United States and Israel.
Well, if I may interject, just to let's see, put a word in for Elie Wiesel's book there. I agree with you, right? But on the other hand, it's really I think the genre explains a lot of what's going on there. It is a program book, what we call a program, right? So, right. So he had a certain social agenda, right? A program there, right? And right. Absolutely. So a lot of good came from it. But one of the prices to pay, of course, right, is that it did create this really, how shall we call it, an extreme or exaggerated picture, or at least one that needs, some filling in and qualification. Right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it also depends, again, who he talked to, right? And, talking to those, again, few who would be still attending, the synagogue in Moscow. And again, it's, yes, absolutely. I mean, it did play, and Wiesel's book certainly did play a large role in kind of galvanizing the American Jewish community. And what led to the effort, kind of, let my people go. And so I'm not diminishing its importance, but right,
for historical purposes,
historical and kind of cultural purposes. And I think Wiesel probably knew that, at least later.
Yeah. Well, what I mean is, it's we need to understand, if we approach this topic from a historical standpoint, that Wiesel's book is not necessarily a primary source, right, for reconstructing actual Soviet Jewish life. Right. It is certainly important and necessary for, like, if we want to, write about American Jewish history, right, in relation, right, to co-religionists in the Soviet Union. Yes, but again, I think you have you did justice, right? You're very fair, right, on this explanation of Wiesel's book, and in a very enlightening way. Well, let's jump to the Strugatsky brothers, if you don't have any objections. I was very much liked what I read. That is, well, it's not a cheery topic, of course, but you do point out that there's this almost, at least in the background, this ubiquitous engagement, right, with the Holocaust throughout their oeuvre. So,
right.
So can you elaborate on that? Give us a few examples.
Yeah. And before just again sort of thinking about these, different layers within the bookshelf, right? Again, you have somebody like Feuchtwanger, this German Jewish novelist, front and center. Of course, then the bulk other works, the books written in Russian, a lot of which would again be the few books that would officially discuss what we can call the Holocaust. Right. Sometimes absolutely explicitly. Right. You can call at, for instance, the diary by Masha Rolnikaite. Right. Her diary.
Yes.
In the Vilna Ghetto, the book that was, yes, it was censored. Yes. But it was it was a Holocaust book. Right. It talked about her time in the Vilna Ghetto. There was, and so, it was absolutely treasured by the, by the Soviet Jewish reader. Then again, I look at the books, for instance, this, scientific atheist books that discussed Judaism. Look at some of the ways that the Hebrew Bible, for instance, could be read, right? Because you couldn't just go and get the Bible; it was unheard of. Right? And so again, it is very much a fragmentary culture that I'm discussing, right? But you can take these fragments and piece them together, and actually something substantial comes out of it. And so the Strugatskys are part of it, right? So these major Soviet sci-fi authors, from the early 60s, two brothers, Arkady and Boris, who were half Jewish. Their father was Jewish, their mother was Russian, and who become kind of these cult authors, and their readers. Millions of their readers would very much look at them as almost kind of in this prophetic sense. And if you look at most of the literature, pretty vast literature written about the Strugatskys, the Jewishness is just not discussed at all, but completely overlooked, and often in response to my work, right, they respond like, well, why even? There's nothing there. So yes, they were Jewish. They didn't like some of the anti-Semitism that they faced, etc. But that's where it ends. But what I discovered, and a number of other scholars, working in Israel in particular, who also came from the former Soviet Union, is it's the Jewishness is so ubiquitous in their work, both in the works that were officially published, but also in the works that they could not publish, right? In a myriad of fascinating ways, which just it's impossible to overlook, right? So those who are overlooking it kind of have blind on their eyes, or just cannot imagine that somebody who's a sort of a major Russian writer could also be a major Jewish writer, right? That's something that Russian critics to this very day just can't grasp that that's possible. And these Jewish layers in their work are of different kinds. It is engagement with Judaism, the Kabbalah, Jewish history, and of course the Holocaust, right? And here again, I should say, just like when I talked about the kind of the absence of the public space for expressing Jewishness, the same is true of the Holocaust. And much more insidiously, on the part of the regime that really did not want to acknowledge kind of the separate Jewish fate during the war. There were some, if you look at the very end of the war, during the war, immediately after the war, but ultimately, especially with the kind of the anti-Semitic campaigns initiated by Stalin in his last years, right? There's really an erasure of the fact that Jews were specifically targeted by the Germans with the collaboration of the local population, right? And so so in official historiography, which was enormous, right? What was called the Great Patriotic War, how World War II was called in the Soviet jargon, right? It was an enormous place it occupied in the Soviet,
of course, yes,
Soviet universe for obvious reasons. But the specific face of Jews was not just there, right? They talk about peaceful Soviet citizens who were killed. But again, if you start piecing these fragments here and there, right, in those rare books, or references in some other books, and so Strugatsky's the sci-fi works that they write in the early 60s are part of that. I think they're deliberately trying to talk about the Holocaust, sometimes in allegorical ways. And sometimes even in more explicit ways. So the first book which is really their first serious work, where they're also confronting the Holocaust, is Escape Attempt, right? Published in the early 60s, which is still part of that phase in their oeuvre, where they're imagining this ideal communist future in the 22nd century. Everything is hunky-dory. And you have these progressors, right, who are essentially kind of historians who travel to other planets to study them. And first it is kind of this very idealistic, very idealistic characters that they depict. Gradually they become pretty grim and much more pessimistic. So what happens in that in Escape Attempt, this novella, short work, is that these guys, these progressors, travel to another planet because they meet this guy Saul in Russian, who says that he needs to find a planet for refuge. They don't quite know who he is, and so they come to this planet where they discover this horrible society, and they don't know what to do with this society, right? And Saul is the only one who actually gets it. And it's very clear from their descriptions that they're describing what's been called kind of a camp universe. Which invokes, interestingly, again, and there's always this interweaving of the Holocaust and the Gulag,
Right.
Stalinist totalitarianism and the Holocaust in these works. And so the universe that they depict, this camp universe that brings to mind both the Nazi camps and the Soviet camps. And again, these two young men, these protagonists, who come from this, ideal communist future, they don't understand how human beings can behave toward one another in this way, right? Saul gets it. Why does Saul get it? Because he comes from the 20th century. He is a Soviet soldier, right, who was trying to escape from the Nazi camp, again, somehow ends up in the future. And this was the first time, and Boris Strugatsky later on, wrote about it. He said why this work became their sort of breakthrough is because for the first time, they did not try to explain anything. How do they get to the future? How does he get, from the 20th century into the future? It just happened, right? And they said, we just felt liberated because we did not want to explain it.
Right.
So it's clear that they're not interested kind of in the technicalities, right? Sort of what's called naучная фантастика in Russian, scientific fantasy.
Right. The technological aspects.
Technological aspect sort of goes away, and they're clearly after something else, right? And so by the end of the book, Saul returns to the 20th century kind of to finish the job and to kill the German officer, and instead he is killed, right? And so I describe it, I mean, in detail in the book about how they go about doing this, because on the one hand they can insert all these Holocaust references because it is all in the framework of World War II. And there was sort of a lot of literature written about camps, and Soviet, prisoners of war who were in the Nazi camps, right? So they can do that within that framework, within a larger kind of allegorical sci-fi framework. But again, it's clear if you read this carefully, which at least I think some readers at that time did, it is clear that they're thinking about the Holocaust. But through that, they're also really thinking about Gulag and the Stalinist camp. Right. And Boris writes that actually, at least originally, they wanted for Saul to escape from the Soviet camp, and they could not do that. So they change it to the Nazi camp. Interestingly, again, kind of the Nazi camp is much more permissible in the Soviet, in the Soviet context than the than the Soviet camp, right? But also what's fascinating is just his name, Saul, which clearly, a Jewish name, a biblical name. Later, we learn his full name at the end, and he happens to be a Russian guy. Which again, I think they absolutely kind of had to do it, for censorship. Right. Of course. But the fact that again he's called Saul, and then they refer to him as Saul in their drafts, in their conversations. I think it's clear to me that they envision him as a Jewish guy, right? That work, along with a number of other writers, other works, really was a breakthrough in Soviet sci-fi. And I should say now I'm working on a new book about Soviet and East European science fiction. Again, particularly paying attention to the Jewish aspects, Holocaust aspects, and discovering that, of course, well, not of course, but really discovering that there were many other writers who were doing something similar to the Strugatskys, and in fact, Strugatskys were probably learning from them. Of course, we can talk about these other writers. And so in the book, in a work like Escape Attempt, kind of the Holocaust is front and center. And what makes the Strugatskys interesting is that, yes, there is an allegory there, right? But these are what I call, maybe we talked about that in our previous conversation, what I call kind of detailed allegories. Right. Yes. They're not simplistic. They're not kind of just these lofty ideas sort of somewhere floating in the air, but they're very detailed. They're rooted in history, right? And so what I do in the book, for instance, in my analysis, right, I look at a passage from Escape Attempt, and then I look at a passage from Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. books Strugatsky could not have known.
Right.
Interestingly, the only work of Levy's, Primo Levy's, that was translated into Russian, published in the Soviet Union, was his science fiction short story.
Right.
That had nothing to do with the Holocaust, right?
Right.
But you see that they're speaking the same language, Levy and the Strugatskys, right? Sort of, they're both creating this. For Levy, it's really recreating the camp universe that he knew so well, right? And for them, right, kind of imagining it, drawing on these sources and kind of intuition and things like that. In their other works, for instance, like the Ugly Swans, Gadkii Lebedi, work that they had very difficult time publishing. Ultimately, was published in samizdat. Some of it was published abroad. They're drawing. It is a much more allegorical presentation of the Holocaust, definitely anti-Semitic history, although again still detailed. There's very, very interesting writer and scholar, Denis Sobolev, who teaches at the Haifa University in Israel, and who was one of the few people who also really thought about Jewishness in the Strugatsky's work and wrote about them. And there's an interesting debate between the two of us about the Ugly Swans, and he sort of disagrees with my readings in a very interesting way. But I think that Holocaust layer is there in the Ugly Swans, which is a fascinating work, probably one of my favorite. What
do you think about the film adaptation? I assume you've seen it.
I've seen it, yeah, but it's interesting, but it's very, very loose. I mean, it's
yes.
Yeah.
Right, we agree on that then. Yes. Yes.
So, and we, I mean, there are so many examples again where that Holocaust layer comes through in the Strugatsky's work. But also what's probably even more interesting is other ways that they insert Jewishness, right?
Right, like I believe you mentioned, and I seem to recall in my own reading what to me looked like word puns, right? In some of their work, which very clearly wouldn't make any sense unless they're dealing with Judaism or even Hebrew, right? Hebrew names.
Either in Monday Begins on Saturday, or still in the Doomed City, kind of their masterpiece that they again absolutely could not publish in the Soviet Union. So yeah, I very much see the Strugatskys as kind of major Jewish writers.
Right, and you'd mentioned well-known fact for anyone familiar with Russian Soviet history, that in the early heady days of the Bolshevik Revolution, there was this anthem, that we're going to make the fairy tale reality, this utopian daydream. And the Strugatsky brothers at one point sort of repeat that, but they inject Kafka into it, right? So it's a Kafkaesque fairy tale. So can you elaborate on that? Because it's how did they get access, to Kafka? That's an interesting question in itself.
Right. So what I'm talking about there is, there was this famous Soviet sort of song, which said, "Мы рождены, чтоб сказку сделать были." We were born to make a, fairy tale a reality. And then the Strugatskys didn't coin it, but I think it very much applies to them, right? There was this saying, in the Soviet Union that we were born to make Kafka a reality. And Kafka was tremendously important for the Strugatsky brothers. It was also really, really important for kind of the intelligentsia of this thaw period. And I think, again, the Jewish angle is interesting here. And this is what I begin my book with. So the only volume of Kafka's writings in the Soviet Union comes out, I think it's 1964, if I remember the date.
Rather late.
And it was a pretty hefty volume. It included the trial and included a lot of the short stories. Essentially, it included all the major works except for the castle. The translator, Kovaleva, who translated a lot of Kafka, very, very important translator, who was also Jewish, translated also a lot of American literature. She did translate the castle, but just could not publish it. But I actually do think that if, for instance, if you look at the Strugatsky Snail on the Slope,
yes, yes,
which just has such parallels with the castle, Kafka's The Castle, and I think they had access to the to Wright Kovalev's translation. They hung out in the same circles, and you know, but and so Kafka was officially published, and you know, it's interestingly that it was published with this preface by this scholar of, you know, German literature, you know, British literature, Suchkov, who was not Jewish and who was a champion of translations of, you know, as I said, German literature, American literature, British literature into Russian. He wanted, for instance, to have Joyce translated into Russian, Robert Musil, and so he writes in this preface to this Kafka volume. He talks about Kafka's Jewishness, right, and he says something that, you know, that his Jewish identity mattered a lot to him, right? And so here's just kind of a not even a sentence, a phrase, you know, half of a sentence in this preface, but it's of enormous significance, right? Because again, when you imagine this vacuum, this complete silence over anything Jewish, and then whatever there was, again, as I said, this anti-Semitism, here you have this new writer that everybody is fascinated with, right? And where he happens to be a Jew, and this important scholar says actually his Jewishness mattered to him. So I think, you know, that would be, again, that would be treasured by the Soviet Jewish reader, and the Strugatskys were fascinated with Kafka. At some point, I think Boris says, I think I quoted, says something like, "Let's make it sound like Kafka, right? Let's make it." You know, let's write like Kafka, right? Let's make it Kafkaesque. So Kafka was very, very important, you know, for them. And again, it's interesting. Zatonsky, there was this scholar, you know, Zatonsky, who wrote a book about Kafka in the 1970s. Really interesting book where he draws on some of the Western scholarship about Kafka, and he talks openly about, you know, about Jewishness in Kafka's work.
Sure.
As you know, I mean, some say that we can see him as a Jewish prophet, etc., etc. So Kafka, and again, it shows you how that sort of Soviet censorship worked. Because on the one hand, you know, anything that again concerned the war, the Holocaust, or immediate Soviet Jewish present, by and large, that could not be officially published. But when it came to somebody like Kafka, you know, this writer from Austro-Hungary, dead. Yeah, you can do that.
Right. It's all fiction anyway, right?
Yeah, that's fine, right? That's sort of or when it came to Feuchtwanger, oh fine, you know, German Jewish, we can do that. Yeah. When it came, as I said, when it came to kind of that immediate Soviet Jewish present, that doesn't exist, right? That's but you had to go kind of these roundabout ways. And I think the Strugatskys understood that. Unfortunately, you know, and this is where, again, a lot of this sort of opposition to seeing them as Jewish writers comes from. Boris writes an essay, an article in the early 1990s, so already during the Perestroika period,
yes.
sort of the Jewish question, where he essentially says, you know, there is nothing that makes Soviet Jews Jewish except for anti-Semitism, you know. And, you know, and I even, you know, said, it's not, I mean, I don't want to say suggest, but I say then, either then, you know, when Boris writes this, that means that he really was not an active participant in that tandem between him and his brother. But that's of course not true. And, you know, but he was, you know, he was doing it. He had an agenda in mind, and he was speaking to a certain audience. But even then deliberately overlooking their entire body of work, and especially the doomed city, you know, they have one of the two central characters is explicitly Jewish, right? Sort this Jewish philosopher Isa, right? So to overlook all of that is just absolutely you know, absolutely bizarre.
Right. The way I would phrase it is, right, the metaphor I like to use in a lot of this type of case is that when we have two conflicting pieces of evidence, right, from a common source, if one is much larger, right, as to volume and temporally, right, we have to view the minority instance through the prism of that much larger piece of evidence rather than the other way around, right? Because that's the logical way of looking at it, even if we can't explain why there's this odd contradiction, right? So there's some explanation that just it's beyond our discovery, at least at present, but certainly it cannot, as you say, like cancel reality, right? The reality of all those decades of work, whereas I think it's quite obvious actually. And a very important aspect of Judaism throughout all ages is that doesn't have to be explicit, right? One doesn't have to wear it on one's arm, as they say, right?
Yes,
It's the subtlety and the esotericism of it, right? Also, my friend Elliot Wolfson, the expert on Jewish esotericism, stated once, and sometimes, and this is where I think about cases like Mandelstam and Chagall, of course, would be very similar to that, right? Because of the Christian element in his biography. It is when one is an outsider that one is most authentically an insider. That's very much like a Kafka parable, like the before the law parable that Kafka has. He never gets past the gate.
Yeah.
And he's so sincere in his waiting and so earnest in wishing for it that really he's already there. He's already arrived. Right. So that's I think again that's a Jewish I would say characteristic that I think we can see throughout the Strugatsky brothers' work.
Right. And again, I mean, here I think the cultural context and the biographical historical context absolutely matters. I don't want to argue that that somehow they were observant Jews, not at all. I mean, they were incredibly skeptical about any religion, and again, whatever Jewish knowledge they had to piece from these various fragments. But it is absolutely clear that it's at the heart of what they're
one final issue here. So in your forthcoming or in your upcoming work, right, where you're going to expand in the Eastern Europe here, so I'm just going to assume, right, you have to be dealing in part with Stanislaw Lem, and so the one topic I would bring up here to see what your thought is on this is, all right, so we think of the Strugatsky brothers' work on the roadside picnic, at least that's the way it was translated in English, which was famously turned into rather loosely adapted, right, by Tarkovsky, the Stalker.
Yeah.
Magnificent film, right, in itself.
Yes.
But in Roadside Picnic, there's this issue that we discussed in our previous conversation, right, about first of all, there's this, extraterrestrial visitation. It's very fleeting, right, doesn't last very long. And human beings are somewhat obsessed, right, with what it all means and why would they come to visit us. But really one of the main points is that, well, maybe they just came, this is an insight, right, that occurs within the narrative of the book. Well, maybe they just came for a picnic, right? And, they were really concerned about us. After all, did they talk to anyone, right? So there's this like lack of, well, of course, there's like the arrogance, right, the hubris of human thought, right, that would make us assume that the extraterrestrials were interested in us if they were to visit this planet. But there's also this lack of communication theme, right? And so when you think of the Solaris by Lem, I wonder if there's a sort of parallelism we can establish there, because in it's on two levels. First, it's with this alien intelligence, which is this sentient ocean, right? And it attempts to communicate, right, in ways that are not first recognized. It's communicating through their dreams, and somehow this can lead to materializations of people who are dead, right? That the dreamer knew in life, right? But then at the end of the novel, there's this, for me, an extraordinarily engaging, moving conversation about God, which I believe might have been censored partly. But the point there is that, well, you know, if we can't understand, if we might not be able to even recognize the presence of an alien intelligence, even if it were right in front of our face, you know, how could we feign to like believe that we could wrap our minds around something like the concept of God, right? And so what I'm seeing here is a common thread. Like there is this inability to communicate, as if to, let's be literal now, that within society, there are different groups, right, whose authentic core, right, how they really want to express themselves is not allowed. And so there is just this impossibility, a virtual impossibility to recognize each other as what they truly are. Right. All right. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, that's, and it's, I think you did a great, you know, way.
That's the esoteric level, I'm saying. Yeah. Right.
You know, summarizing Lem and kind of what Lem is really after. It also really works, you know, if you think about the Soviet, particularly the Stalinist context, right, where sort of Stalin is elevated to the ineffable, right, to really sort of this godhead, and this is where Mandelstam is also, you know, interesting. If you look at his poem, which praises Stalin, right? I mean, some have argued kind of, I mean, Joseph Brodsky argued that poem absolutely terrified Stalin much more than the epigram, because the epigram he could understand. Yeah, this poem that really tries to imagine Stalin as this kind of divine godhead. Stalin didn't quite. I mean, that frightened him, right? And so I think, and again, that Stalinist context, and in general, how sort of the Soviet project was very much conceived as a, you know, as a sacred project that has taken that sacred terminology and ideas, bringing them down to earth, and, you know, and creating this new sort of body of scripture, you know, Marx, Lenin, Engels, etc., etc. And so I think, yes, kind of what you're saying is would really work in the Soviet context, and also really, you know, kind of the philosophy of language, right? The language either as a communicator, right, or language is something that precisely divides humanity, right? Because we all see different languages that cannot be adequately translated. No, I think absolutely. And Lem, yes, Lem is, you know, will be really important in this new project that I'm working on. And the more that I'm reading, you know, Soviet sci-fi of the post-war period and thinking about it, it becomes very, very clear to me that Lem, everything comes back to Lem. That all of these, you know, major interesting Soviet sci-fi authors had Lem on their minds, and either paid homages to him or argued with him, and that's absolutely true about the Strugatskys. And it's, you know, interesting that, you know, and Lem was beloved in the Soviet Union. I mean, translated multiple copies, you know, and really Lem did not have good things to say about the Russians and, you know, what the Russians are capable of. But he absolutely, you know, valued and realized that kind of the readership and the community he had in the Soviet Union he didn't have anywhere else. But so one of the writers, critics, and that I'm working on now is Raphael Nudelman, who was a major sci-fi author in his own right during that period. He was also one of the major translators of Lem into Russian. And he was also one of the kind of major critics of science fiction and even theoreticians of science fiction. In that period, later he becomes part of the Jewish underground, immigrates to Israel in the late 1970s, and becomes one of the major, Russian intellectuals in Israel. He maintained a correspondence with Lem throughout all these years, and that correspondence includes some very, very interesting commentary on Lem's work, but also the Strugatsky. And while they both loved the Strugatskys, and Nudelman knew them, closely and very, very, very well, they were also somewhat skeptical about the Strugatskys, because Lem and Nudelman felt that the Strugatskys were, I guess, too tied to the reality, right? That they were sometimes they're kind of these sci-fi scenarios and allegories are just too tied to the immediate Soviet presence, and kind of Lem felt that they needed to rise above that, and kind of
some of the socialist realism.
And be sort of deeper in their thinking, be more philosophical, be more, and maybe that's one of the sort of the criticisms that Lem has in terms of the roadside picnic. And then Lem says something very interesting in one of the letters to Nudelman, and he says, Strugatskys are my favorite disciples, and they're wonderful, right? So he says everything that they do essentially, comes back to me. And then he says, one can only be proud of students like that. But then he says, I really wish that they would produce something truly original. And he believed that they never did, right? He believed that they never did, which I think one can absolutely disagree with. But it really shows kind of that, but also coming back to what you said, I was just writing and reading. So Nudelman writes this really, really fascinating essay published in 1964, all officially published, which is called A Conversation on a Train. And it's a conversation between him, Nudelman, and a robot, kind of this artificial intelligence, and anti-I, right? Somebody there to debate you. Get this idea from another fascinating writer that I'm also writing about now, Gennady Gor, very prolific, who's also Jewish, and fascinating figure. And so they're debating what does science fiction mean? What is the nature of sci-fi? And Nudelman says that there are two camps within sci-fi. One that he calls relativist camp, associated with Lem, and then another one that he calls kind of anthropocentric, the one that's sort of centered on humanity, right? And he associates it with Yefremov, this major sci-fi author who writes about this, ideal communist future. Yeah. And Nudelman says, my heart lies with the first camp, the relativist camp, the Lem camp. It really looks at human nature in much more, sort of sees it as much more traumatic, much more tragic, right? And that ultimately does not see humanity as the beginning and end of it all, right? And sees it as a sort of a great phenomenon, but an ordinary phenomenon. One of the phenomena that exist out there. Yeah. And he says kind of Lem's point, and that's exactly what you were talking about. Lem's point is about how humanity confronts the ineffable.
Right.
And realizes via this confrontation is that, again, they're not what they thought they were. Yeah. And he says, and then Nudelman says, there's so much more hope in that failure than in this triumphant march through history, represented by this kind of much more optimistic and positivist. Yeah. And that's I think that's very, very perceptive. And it really also shows how these sci-fi thinkers in the Soviet Union were trying to get away from this, again, optimistic, positivistic model. Right. But also recognizing, again, through Lem, that it is about this confronting the ineffable with which you cannot establish contact, right? With which you do not have a common language, period, right? And while, as you mentioned, and I talked about that first translation of Solaris, pretty much that entire conversation about God was taken out.
Mhm.
Yeah, but Noodleman, of course, knew it, right? Because he also
Right. Yes.
translated Solaris, and he had access to the Polish edition. Yeah. So
Right.
there's
Some of these authors have different temperaments, obviously, because when we talk about when they talk about serious sci-fi, right? Well, my first reaction is that sounds like a temperament difference with the Strugatsky brothers, because the Strugatsky brothers have something that I don't see in Lem, though. Right, I'm not as well read in Lem as I am in the Strugatsky brothers, but that is the brothers' humor.
Oh, I agree.
You know, and this is something also is very Jewish, right? So,
right. Yeah, I mean, they're much more. They're playful, right?
yes.
There's also humor in Lem, kind of this absurdist humor, and it's a Kafkaesque humor.
Right.
Like,
it's very different.
Yeah, kind of the bathtub. What's the the bathtub novel? But Lem was not in his. I think if you read his letters, he was a funny guy in life.
Well, I'm
But-
sure.
But when it came to sci-fi, and this is where his absolutely his opposition to most of American sci-fi comes from, right? He thought all of it. I mean, he said pretty much most of it was garbage.
Like Philip K. Dick. That's what he thought of
Except for
him.
some
Yeah.
of Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
And I was just reading. I was Ursula Le Guin's archive is
Mhm.
not far from Portland at the University of Oregon.
Mhm.
So I was just there reading Lem's correspondence with Le Guin, and she was one of the few that he valued, or at least some of her work. But the rest he just thought it was all garbage. And yeah,
Right.
so yes, Lem kind of has that pedantic
Mhm. Mhm.
streak, which is I think the Strugatskys were much more playful, but it is if in kind of uncovering this or recovering, I don't know, this milieu around sci-fi in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I mean, it's fascinating how much Jewishness played a role there. And of course, in Lem's case, who went through the war, who was Jewish, who survived in Lvov, Lviv, in what is now Western Ukraine, survived most likely with kind of fake papers.
That's right. Yes.
And almost never explicitly talked about it in his work, and some have interpreted it again as sort of as a survivor guilt, or that he couldn't for censorship reasons. Now that I think more about it, I think that's not quite right. I think Lem absolutely deliberately did not want to allow anything personal in his work, because he was so invested in that idea of creating this kind of philosophical
right.
science fiction. So the Holocaust is there. I think again, this sort of his understanding of human condition and this imperfect God also comes because of that understanding of the horror that humanity went through. But I think he deliberately kind of removed the personal, because that was just part of his method as a writer, as a thinker. And that's different. Again, that's different from the Strugatskys. That's different from some other.
It is. I think that also in the Strugatsky brothers, we have a lot of philosophy, but it's in a different key than in Lem. Right. It's again, it's a little more esoteric, if we want to put it that way.
Yeah.
It comes through the storylines, right, and the larger situations, right. More so that, although there are sometimes these extraordinarily profound philosophical passages and conversations,
but it's not as heavy-handed as in Lem.
Right, but it's not as heavy, right, as absolutely. Let's say Solaris, right?
Yes.
I don't think I smiled once or cracked a smile once the whole time reading through Solaris. It's very engaging. I love it, but it's very serious. It's a very serious.
Absolutely. Yeah. You cannot imagine Lem writing, say, work
right. And the humor in the Strugatsky brothers I wonder if you would agree. For me, there's two types. There's a main one, the one that's generally there, and it's very enjoyable. But now and then you do get this sort of, I think it's an esoteric criticism of like the authoritarian structures,
Yeah.
right, that they were living under, and so
Right.
it is humorous, but there's also something that, right, when one knows the reason for this, it becomes a little less humorous because one knows the serious situation they were actually living in, and the necessity to engage in all of these strategies, right, and what that does to human psychology. Right, it's not
no,
pleasant,
absolutely,
but
and I think part of that has to do with sort of their antecedents. If you look at Russian literature of the 1920s that they were drawing on, which was absurdist and playful. There's of course this very absurdist streak in Central European literature as well, but Czech,
sure,
and Polish, which again Lem knew very well. But yes, but ultimately, he can be playful, especially in these, his books that imagine, kind of reviews for the books that were never written. And I mean, he can be very, very, very playful, but ultimately, yes, he can also be very, very heavy-handed. For instance, if you look at his Golem, his Golem book about this supercomputer, which is really his book about the ineffable and the transcendent, and
that's right, yes,
sort of, and this very kind of post-humanist understanding of humanity. I mean, this is incredibly heavy-handed.
yes,
it takes energy and time to get through it.
Yes. Well, let's end with a personal question I have, right, going back to Mandelstam, and that is the poem in praise of Stalin. Now, my personal impression, right, and that's all it is, but it's always been this way for me, right? When I always consider him very Jewish, and maybe Aulla Wolfson, right? Maybe he's more Jewish for the fact of the personal history that he went through and the attraction of Christianity and all of this. There's something that it is as if it intensifies his Jewishness. But anyway, I have always read that poem, and it has always struck me as sort of a very serious tongue-in-cheek, and that is that he is portraying Stalin as a god, but this is because he knows that this is idolatry, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting, right? And again, speaks to Mandelstam, who was sort of thoroughly Jewish, right? And because of the milieu that he comes from. And it's interesting even that if you read The Noise of Time, the autobiography that I talked about, and his depiction of his parents, where he talks about his mother as somebody who was able to speak kind of this beautiful sonorous Russian.
Yes.
He believes that he can be a poet in Russian because of that lineage, because of her. And then he talks about his father as somebody who had no language, right? He didn't really have German, didn't have Russian, didn't have Yiddish, didn't have Hebrew. And I read it. I even wrote about it in my dissertation on Mandelstam, that it was a serious critique of assimilation, right? This kind of languagelessness. Because Mandelstam valued enormously both Hebrew and Yiddish, right? And he wrote this beautiful and very important essay on the Moscow Yiddish theater. And then Solomon Michoels, who was major actor in that theater, later becomes director, and then killed by Stalin after the war. And the way that he describes Michoels and what he represents, right, shows that this, again, enormous value that Mandelstam put in Jewish cultural heritage, in Judaism, which again doesn't mean that he became, clearly an observant Jew. That's not what we're talking about. But he absolutely, he appreciated it and valued it. If you read probably his most difficult prose work called The Egyptian Stamp, where there are a lot of these Jewish layers, which again can be interpreted differently.
Sure.
But they're absolutely there. But I'll end with, it's interesting what you said about idolatry. Because another poet that I spent really a decade plus working on, and that's my first book, and that's on the poet Boris Slutsky.
Slutsky,
Who, you know, becomes a major poet after the war, and also thinks a lot about Stalin. And I very much discuss Slutsky as Slutsky's project as sort of Slutsky sees Soviet history as this rivalry between this new god that was created, Stalin, and the old god, the Hebrew god that Stalin kind of takes and put him in the corner. That's exactly what Slutsky says in his poem about Stalin, which he calls God, right? So Slutsky's project is to reverse that, right? Is to take down this idol, this new god that was created, and restore the Hebrew god to his rightful place. So it's interesting, right? And Slutsky was a careful reader of Mandelstam. And again, to me, Slutsky is an example of what it means to write Judaic poetry in Russian. Now, what's interesting is that at the same time, Slutsky was an official figure, and even though most of his poetry would not publish. Anyway, there are some fascinating kind of complexities and different contexts. But I very much see Slutsky kind of as this, not even a Jewish poet, but a Judaic poet, right? Who takes the idea
I understand. Yes,
very seriously, right? And
and
writes what the line that I use, that's the title of my book about Slutsky, is I'm to be read not from left to right, but in Jewish from right to left, right? And what that means to write that way in Russian. Yeah. So
yes. Well, thank you so much, Marat. It's been I appreciate the donation of your time and the donation of your wisdom.
Yeah, yes. And you too. You're such a wonderful partner and person to discuss all of this.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.